We have the very mysteries of God, and how we steward those mysteries matters. And so what Paul's going to say is that the way that you should steward these mysteries is that you should do it with absolute faithfulness before God, knowing that everything you do, every motive you have, every thought that you have, every action you take is before God. Of God. Go ahead and underline those words, servants and stewards, because Paul's using two images here right from the get-go. Two images for how the believer should see themselves. Two ways that Paul sees himself as an apostle and how he sees the church leaders. He says, firstly, we are servants. A servant is one who's set aside their own rights in order to serve another. The New Testament uses this idea of a servant a lot. The idea that Christ did not come into the world to be served, but to serve. It says this of Christ in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus took on the form of a servant, even to the point of death on the cross. Jesus later calls his disciples servants. It's a status of lowness, a status of low recognition. And it's interesting, this word servant here is not even the word that most commonly is used for servant. This is actually a really strange word for Paul to use here. It represents the lowest status of servant you can possibly think of. This word would represent like the rowers in a boat. If you think of a large ship, the ones who are down beneath rowing the boat along. What Paul is saying is, hey, I'm not the captain of this ship. I'm just the one who keeps the boat moving. I know who my master is, and I follow after him. That's what we do as apostles and church leaders, Paul says. Even though Paul has an immense amount of authority as an apostle to lead the church, he says, I see myself as a servant. The next image he uses is of a steward. Now, when we think of stewardship, I think oftentimes we think of finances. We might think of the things that I own, the things that are valuable to me, my money, my home, my car, the things that belong to me that I need to take care of so that they will last a long time. But at the heart of stewardship, it's not what belongs to me, it's actually what belongs to God. It's what's been given to me. And so a helpful translation of steward might be an estate manager or someone who manages a property. You might think of the story of Joseph in Genesis. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and eventually he becomes the servant for a man named Potiphar. And it says that he's this low status servant, but then he eventually becomes the one who oversees the entire estate of this man, Potiphar. He becomes the steward of Potiphar's whole property. A steward is a servant who's been entrusted with great responsibility. And together, these two images of the servant steward represent low status but high responsibility. And he says, that is what we are. We are servant stewards. This is how we should identify in Christ. And if we just do this, it will kill this pride that's dividing, that's wedging its way between us. And that we have this high responsibility is because of the very thing that we steward. Do you see it here? They are servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Mysteries of God is a mysterious word. It's like, why would you use that wording, Paul? Paul, he uses this in many of his letters. He refers to the mysteries of God. I like the way he defines it in the book of Colossians. In his letter to the Colossians, he says this, chapter 2, verse 1, it says, I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and of knowledge. This mystery of God is the message of the cross. Christ crucified. Christ who's come to die and to give his life as a ransom for many. Can you imagine being entrusted with this kind of a responsibility? This is the responsibility the apostles have been given. That they've been witnesses of the life and the work of Christ. And now they share that witness with others. In fact, they even write it down, being inspired by God. They write his words down in what we hold today in our Bibles. That many of those New Testament words were written by the apostles, that they would pass it on. Can you imagine that kind of responsibility? To steward the mysteries of God. That an all-powerful, all-perfect, all-sufficient, all-knowing, all-holy God would become a servant to the point of death. That's why Paul calls it a mystery. And we should join him and be like, yeah, this is the most mysterious thing we can even imagine. Why would a God who's all-powerful, all-sufficient, all-holy do that for men? Can you imagine? Imagine the responsibility of being trusted with that message. And yet the apostles wrote that message down. And they passed it on to successive generations so that it's at our fingertips today. That we have the mysteries of God on our slides, at our fingertips, on our iPads, on our iPhones, in our books. We have the very mysteries of God. And how we steward those mysteries matters. And so what Paul's going to say is that the way that you should steward these mysteries is that you should do it with absolute faithfulness before God, knowing that everything you do, every motive you have, every thought that you have, every action you take is before God. Look at verse 2 with me. It says, moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. That we be found faithful. Notice this, faithfulness is the metric of our success. If you're in this room today and you call yourself a disciple, a follower of Jesus, our metric for success should be faithfulness. That we walk with God. We know him. We follow him faithfully, diligently. This is our life's calling. And what Paul says is that our faithfulness, it shouldn't be motivated by what other people think about us. Our motives, our actions, they shouldn't be motivated by what others think of us. It shouldn't even be motivated by what we think of ourselves. It should be motivated by how God sees us. Look at this in verses 3 through 5. It says this, but with me is it a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God.